Hello, wonderful LinkedIn people. Graham here. Thanks for joining me live on LinkedIn. I'm live on your feed. I'm going to be talking about podcast guesting and specifically why you should think about podcast guesting as a thought leader, how you can use podcast guesting to build your thought leadership profile. You can ask me any questions at any time during this live. I'm going to record it as well, put it out on YouTube for the archive. But whilst you're here, feel free to ask me questions about thought leadership, personal branding, storytelling, podcast, guesting. Let's have a look at some of the data. If we can start by looking at some of the data today on podcasts. Yeah, let's get that slide up. 4 million podcasts in the world, according to latest estimates. 50 million episodes. That's where we are. That's a lot of podcasts in the world right now. So what does that mean? It means that things have changed in the last 2 or 3 years. So I did my first podcast in 2014, which was a long time ago. The podcast industry was very different then. And the last 2 years, things were changed very, not just qualitatively, quantitatively as well. Like a lot has changed in podcasting. A lot of people have started podcasts. A lot of people have started listening to podcasts. The market has changed. It's moved from being a niche to very much a mainstream. We've seen an explosion of B2C content and an explosion of B2B and B2E podcasts as well. That's really happened in the last 2 years. And if you look at that data again, that's really telling, because what's happened is now there are podcasts on everything. There are podcasts about everything imaginable is out there now. So, my business, my podcast agency business, we're a corporate podcast specialist. We're all about helping people tell better stories through podcasts. If you came to me 3 or 4 years ago and you said, I want to become a thought leader, I want to help build my brand, I want to get out there, I would say to you, you need to start a podcast, because chances are 3 or 4 years ago, it didn't exist. The podcast that you wanted to get out there, the conversations that you wanted to put into the public domain, and the audience that you wanted to connect with, that didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. So it required you to stand up and make it happen. But looking at the numbers today, if you see here, like 50 million, that's changed. So what has changed is it's getting a lot easier to produce podcasts and a lot harder to promote, which means that the challenge now for all podcasters is growing an audience. So I would say to people now, anybody that comes to me now, and I focus a lot of my energies now on podcast guesting, is that actually it's a lot wiser, a lot better return on your time, investment of energy, to guest on other people's podcasts. And this is really the leverage that you get from OPA, which is other people's audiences. Now, think back to those numbers, 50 million people, podcast episodes, that there are 4 million podcasts in the world. Those hosts have curated, nurtured with love to some degree, small micro audiences, anything between 200 to 200,000 people, but they've built those communities for you. So if your niche, if your industry is data, or it's garden furniture, restoration, antique watches, whatever it may be, there is a podcast out there that somebody has already validated and built an audience for. So they've done the heavy lifting for you. So if you're interested in reaching that audience, it's probably more effective for you to leverage their work, because you're only going to repeat what that person has done. And by the way, if they have a podcast out there now and they're 20, 30 episodes or more in, you also have the survivor bias that host has got through pod fade and the valley of death to make sure and to get through to the other side and build a sustainable long-term podcast. So they've already done that validating for you. and they've de-risked that process for you. So other people's audiences are key because it's getting really, really hard now to build audiences. I work a lot with podcasters and work a lot with corporates, and this is the number one challenge now. Anybody can start a podcast, but if you look at the data, the average podcast listener on this thing, on this phone, the average podcast listener has 6, maybe 7 podcasts subscribed in their feed. So if you think back to those 50 million episodes, 6 or 7 podcasts, that's not a lot of bandwidth. So if you come along and launch another podcast, you're competing for what is a very stretched commodity. And that commodity is audience attention. Even that word, think of that word, attention. It comes from the same Latin word here, tendere, which means to stretch. The same word for tendon in your muscle. It means to be stretched. And that's the problem. Like our audiences that we're trying to reach, if you want to be a thought leader, you need an audience. And the challenge is that audience is no longer a captive audience. If you write one book, if you create one video, if you do one conference presentation, they are no longer captive. Monday morning, the following week, they've forgotten about you. So their attention is so stretched, and yet you cannot scale, you cannot clone yourself, but your conversations do scale. So the way that you can get out there at scale is to leverage other people's audiences. Get on podcasts that have already built audiences. 200 here, 200, 2,000 here, 10,000 here, 100 here. And each one of these is a new audience. And if you go and speak on these podcasts, a percentage of those will come across and become your audience. It's a great way to leverage other people's work and let them do the heavy lifting for you. And yes, I would put it out there that if you're thinking of starting a podcast, what better way to actually start a podcast than to onboard and do a season of podcast guesting first? Because not only do you get to learn what it's like being on the other side, being in the guest chair, experiencing different podcasts, different hosts, the way they do things, but also you build relationships with hosts and build an audience. So when you actually launch your podcast, you have an audience. You're not launching from zero. If you're launching a podcast from zero, I'm going to put it to you this way, that actually that could take a lifetime to build an audience. It's a lot better for you to de-risk that process and on-ramp to your podcast by podcast guesting. That's what I'm recommending people now. 3 or 4 years ago, I'd say to people, get straight in there, get podcasting, start your own podcast, build your platform. But now things have changed. I would say to people, look, it's too high risk. Sure, you can do it, but the chances of long-term success are smaller than ever before. So better to on-ramp, de-risk that process, and build yourself up to it and launch with an audience. One of the things people say to me is like, why me? Yeah, but no, why would anybody want me on their podcast? And this is the imposter syndrome that really plagues us all, that we feel our story is not worthy enough. We feel somehow that, we look around, you look at your LinkedIn feed and you see survivor bias again, which is people with thousands of likes on their posts, or you see Gary Vee, or you see Stephen Bartlett, and these guys are amazing. They're celebrities. And you look at yourself and you think, I'm not one of them. So why would anybody want to hear my story? And I'll put it to you that you don't have to be a celebrity to have a story worth telling. You don't have to have a finished book to have a story worth telling either. What do you need to have a story worth telling? You need experience. And I bet, and I'm going to take a wild bet on this, that you've experienced something in your life which is worthy of a story. Like, you have left a bank, the comfortable world of a bank, and you started a startup despite the good intentions of your coworkers around you. Oh, you don't want to do that. That's crazy. You're giving up your career. Think of your pension. Or maybe you left a country and you moved to another country. and took a big risk. Or maybe you started a business and you took a gamble on that despite what aunts and uncles, or despite the fact that you had a great career and you went to business school, etc., etc. These are all stories worth telling, because these all are definitions, incarnations of the hero's journey. It's the departure scene. You know, every great story starts with an ending, and that ending is you leaving something behind. If you left something behind in your life, then you have a story worth telling. You know, I graduated with an AI degree in 1995, which was a very long time ago. For those of you who can work it out, that was last century, when AI was a very different world entirely. You know, it wasn't Facebook and Google, no such opportunities back then. So when I graduated, there were no six-figure salaries waiting for me to walk into. Instead, what they advised me was to go and teach English in Japan. You can imagine that, like how different that is today. So I took that opportunity, I left, and I went and taught English in Japan, something very different from what I'd trained for. But that was my departure. It was a physical crossing. I left one continent and moved to another continent. I left one domain of expertise and put myself out there as a newbie, as a beginner, as a teacher. But what I learned in that process is that to be a good communicator, you really have to tell stories. And you think back to your school days, that the best teachers were also the best storytellers. And they were the ones whose lessons that you looked forward to, the lessons that, it doesn't matter if it was maths or it was geography, these are the ones that you looked forward to, right? That teacher, Mr. Davies for me, who was a math teacher, but he would tell stories of these crazy ancient Greeks, you know, philosophers, and angle of instance equals the angle of reflection, that's physics. But that was what really excited me, hearing these stories. And that's what made me look forward to his lessons. And I realized actually that teaching, conveying information wasn't about data, it was about the stories that you could package that data with. And to quote Maya Angelou, she said that people will always forget what you told them, but they will always remember how you made them feel. Now, why am I talking about this now? It's because this is a skill that you need to learn. You know, I had to learn this skill as a teacher. It was new for me. I had to communicate across boundaries, across cultures, across languages. And I had to learn how to present, and I had to learn how to tell stories the hard way. And it's only through practice that I managed to get better at this skill live. You know, I didn't learn it in a book. I didn't take a course. I just had to put myself out there and face rejection and face failure. And that's what makes you a better storyteller. And if I think about my story, is that it's been a mess. You know, I graduated with an AI degree and somehow ended up in the communications industry where I help people tell stories, which is strange, isn't it? Because when you think about that, it seems to be this kind of trajectory which doesn't make sense at the beginning. But by podcast guesting, I have managed to make sense of that. And I want to talk about that a little bit today. I'll talk about agile storytelling. That the reason why you should think about podcast guesting is not because getting on podcasts is a great way to generate leads. It is. You can generate leads through podcast guesting, especially high quality, high ticket item sales. But more importantly, the reason why you should think about podcast guesting is because it is an extremely powerful way for you to develop and refine the craft of storytelling, because the stories that you tell shape everything, absolutely everything, not just business, not just every pitch, not just every sales presentation. But if you hire somebody, it's because they believed in the story that you told about your startup. They want to join you on that journey, that band of merry adventurers going on that quest together. That was the story that they believed in. If you raised money, it was because the founder told a story to the investor about what he was trying to build. It's a story. It's connecting the unknown to a known experience. And if you look at your life as well, It's just a story, and how you interpret your life and make sense of it is really the package that you decide to shape that with. And all of this is a skill. And so one of the reasons why we should think about essentially, getting better at storytelling is it's the one skill in business that shapes and changes everything. And podcasts are a great stage for you to do that. So where do you start? Well, you may say, oh, I'm not good enough for this. But let me put it to you this way, is that one thing that you know better than anybody is the problem. And what am I talking about is that, in the old world, if you wanted to be a thought leader, you had to be an expert, you had to be a PhD, you had to be an MBA, you had to have like 20 years working for that company. And yet that's changed. What has changed is that we don't seek out experts like we used to. We don't see them and listen to them in the same way we pay attention, again, it's that attention word, to the people who understand our problem. So you've got to turn expert mode off and turn empathy mode on. Because what defines thought leaders today isn't a title or a qualification, but by their ability to empathize and understand my problem, your problem, better than the next guy. That's customer competence. I understand your problem better than he does. Therefore, I am in your target, in your attention radar more than that guy, because you understand me. And if you understand me, you have my attention. And if you have my attention, I trust you. And if I trust you, I'm going to listen to what your solution is. So leaning into the problem really means that this is how you can develop thought leadership, not by trying to know everything, but trying to know one thing, which is your problem, and understand it really, really well. So if you want to be a thought leader, the starting point is understanding who your audience is and what their problems and frustrations are. What are their pain points? What do they get bothered by? What triggers them? And how can you help fix that? That defines you as a thought leader. And once you understand that, you can now turn that into a story. So let's talk about storytelling and the power of storytelling in business and how it affects everything and how you can learn some of this as well. This is not magic. This is not like Steve Jobs' Jedi mind hacks, which, you can learn yourself as well. This is not about being super confident and mastering influence. This is about simply learning how storytelling works and how you can apply it. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because podcast guesting is such a great way for you to get on stage and keep practicing that, because you've got to practice in front of a real audience, guys. Just like I am here today with you in front of a real audience, practicing always. There was a documentary on Netflix, Jerry Seinfeld, one of the most successful comedians of all time, a documentary about him, like long after he's had his success as a comedian in Seinfeld, going back to comedy clubs and presenting in front of 100 people, when he had audiences of hundreds of millions globally. Why would he do that? Because he wants to keep practicing. He wants to keep sharp. He wants to keep facing the moment of truth and getting better at his craft of storytelling. Because once you stop, that's where the journey ends, is you've given up. Because storytelling isn't a skill just for business. Storytelling is a skill for life. It's something that can make sense of everything. Let's talk about how it works. I won't go too deep into the psychology of storytelling or the techniques. You can learn a lot of this. I've got a guide. If you go to podcastguestingpro.com/guide, there's a free guide there. It's all online. You can go and learn a bit about storytelling, the 3-box storytelling technique, strategic storytelling, category narratives, the hero's journey, the psychology of storytelling. It's all there. I'm happy to share it with you. I don't want to give you a course. I don't want to charge you for storytelling because, again, storytelling, it's like learning a language. The only way you can do it is actually by immersing yourself in it, facing the moment of truth, facing rejection. Let's talk about soda. Let's start here. I've worked with these guys a number of years. I learned many things about how they tell stories. Think about Red Bull. What a great example. Red Bull and Coca-Cola, multi-billion-dollar industries, they are just fizzy water, sugar, and caffeine. But they can make billions of dollars. Think about it. You can copy the ingredients, the content, easily. If I asked you to create a Coca-Cola knockoff, you could create it. If you asked you to create a Red Bull knockoff, you could create it. It's easy. The formula ingredients are out there. You know the content. You know how to piece it together. But here's the difference. Like when Red Bull launched, they could have launched as a soda, but they said consciously that we're not going to compete as a soda. We're going to compete as an energy drink. So this is really important because they chose their own category, the category that didn't exist yet, energy drinks. When Red Bull launched, when Dieter Mateschitz launched Red Bull with his Thai friend, there was no energy drinks category. So they decided to create it. And they knew if they created energy drinks as a category, they could own it because they could define the storytelling around energy drinks. If they competed as a soda with Coke, they would be like number 5, number 6 soda in the world at best. But if they were going to be an energy drink, they could be number 1. And that's what thought leadership is. It's very similar to how we create world views. Let me explain. Maps. I love maps. As a traveler, I want to show you a map which people may not have seen before. Have you seen this map? I'd be interested to hear in the comments if anybody has seen this map. This is a real map, guys. You've seen many different maps. You've seen the Mercator projection, very strange interpretation of the Earth. You've got to remember that the Earth is a 3D ball, just slightly flattened at the top and bottom. And yet the maps we're presented are like you see now. They are a rectangle, right? So they are interpretations. But here's the interesting thing about a South Up map. If you haven't seen one of these, go and Google it. It's real. South Up map is a real map. And when people see this, they say, well, it's upside down. Well, it's not, because in space, there is no up or down, is there? So it could be like this, just as it is north up normally. And then people will say, well, you know, the reason we have a north up map as default is because that's where a compass points. The compass points north, right? It doesn't. Like, you ask any high school physics student and they'll tell you that a compass points north and south. It's just that at some point in history, some bright fellow decided to paint the north part red. It could have been the south part red. It would have changed history. And so if you accept that as a worldview, everybody has to see the world through your lens, through your narrative, right? Because if you think about it, look at the South Up map, guys. The world is a very different place. Like Africa and South America, you know, all the colonies are huge. And yet, you know, the colonizers are just tiny. Look at the UK. It's just a tiny little dot in the bottom of the map. How insignificant that is. And so if you think about it, that historically we've told the North Up map because it has reinforced our category, our way of thinking, our narratives. And it's not how it is. We accept it. And when people challenge it, they think, oh, wait a minute. And poof, mind blown. You know, I remember when I went to Japan in the 90s and I sat in the office of my new company, the teaching English company. And I sat in the manager's office and I just sat down coming off the plane, waiting for my manager. I looked up on the wall and there was a map there. And it was an Asia Pacific map. It's like, you know, the common map that we see has the Americas on the left, and then you have sort of Europe, Africa axis in the middle, and then Asia out to the right. But this one put the Asia Pacific in the middle. And again, when you look at it, you've got Japan in the center of the world. And then, you know, the UK, where I'm from, is this tiny little island, just like right off in the corner. How insignificant that is. And you look at it and thinking, well, that's wrong. That's not the world. But it is. It's just that somebody has told that story of the world, and that's how people see it. And maps are stories, because maps are interpretation of data. That's all they are. They're interpretations. They're not correct. They're not true. There's no objectivity in a map. You think about it, how it reinforces cultural narratives and history by the way that we see the world. So why am I teaching you this? Why am I sharing this with you? It's because storytelling really is about category narratives. Now, what is a category narrative? Like I talked about with Red Bull, is that what Red Bull did was Red Bull chose the map and owned it. And you too can choose your own map and own it. Because if you choose a map through which people can see the world, you define the narrative. You lead the narrative through which people interpret that world, right? And so if you create a narrative, a category which you lead in by default, the people that follow you will see the world through that narrative, in the same way that Coke could not compete with Red Bull because it wasn't an energy drink. It looked uncool. In the same way that you can own your space and become a thought leader in that space by simply choosing the map by which you want people to see that world through. And the question is that what qualifies you to choose that map? Just by standing up. That's all you need as a qualification. Just by standing up and getting one of these. That's it. There's no other qualification. There isn't a qualification to be a thought leader, is there? We haven't seen it yet. But really what defines a thought leader is your ability to stand on stage and tell that story. And you will find people. Now, the great thing about the internet now is that this sort of diaspora of people out there will find you. Now, 90% of people you talk to about your content, whether you're talking about digital transformation or diversity or sustainability, 90% of people that you talk to about what you do are going to give you this reaction. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I agree. That's completely the wrong reaction you want. Those are people that simply like what you do. If people like you, you might as well be invisible. What you need is to find that 10% who love you, who need, more importantly, your work, who need that map. They're looking for somebody with a map to lead them, because they need to make sense of this world too. And you know what? You've stood up on stage and you've practiced and you thought about that map more than anybody else. And now you're giving it to people as a guide. And now you create this tribe of people around you who believe in that map too. And because you wrote the map, they will follow you. That's thought leadership in practice. So how does this fall back into podcasting? Let's talk a little bit about that. Conscious of some of the comments coming here. Great to see people interacting. Hey guys. So let's get some of these comments up in front of us. So Gina, hey Gina. Keep facing the moment of truth. Yeah, great advice. If I say so myself, well, you said that. Thanks a lot. Yeah, facing the moment of truth, I think, it's all about rejection. There's a great book, by the way, a book that really has made me think. It's a book called it's called Rejection Proof. It's by an author, I think, called Jia Jiang, who was an American Chinese-American student, who was studying in the US. And he entered into this competition with himself called the 100 Days of Rejection. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to get comfortable with rejection. And every day he went through this. It's on YouTube. You can go and watch it, the 100 Days of Rejection. Every day he would set himself a challenge, which became more and more outrageous. So day one, he would walk into Dunkin' Donuts and order a donut in the shape of the Olympic rings, for example, because the Olympics were on at the time. And they may say yes, they may say no. And then he gets a little bit more confident. And one day he would walk up to somebody's house, knock on the door, and say, can I plant this plant in your front garden? And the guy would look at him crazy, like, you off your mind? But he would go through this process. And what he learned was that if you get comfortable with rejection, it's a skill. And the more you get comfortable with it, the more you can reach on the other side of rejection, that moment of truth. So the moment of truth really is fear. And everything that we want to do in our life lives on the other side of fear. We can spend our whole lives posting little status updates on LinkedIn or on YouTube or on Twitter, wherever it may be, little updates here and there. But that's never going to change us. It's never going to make us better, because it's like, think about your legs, right? You're every single day you walk maybe 1,000 meters, whatever it may be, 1,000 steps, 3,000 steps every single day. But if you think about that amount of exercise, you don't have these like completely ripped, powerful, muscular legs, right? Because you're constantly walking within your comfort zone. You're not, walking to fail, to that point of muscle failure. And so therefore you can keep doing this activity day in, day out, like status updates, like posting on social media, and never get anywhere, because it's just like walking. The muscle never gets stronger. But if you push through that failure point, that moment of truth, face rejection, that's where you learn. That's where you get much more powerful. That's where you really improve the craft of storytelling. Thomas Leung. Hey, Thomas. Need good questioning skill to dig out information from audience in order to formulate correct problem statement and pain points they are facing. Yeah, the ability to listen and to empathize. And I think, the key here is really starting from the position of saying you don't know. I don't know the answer to this, but maybe these people do. And then leaning into that problem, really listening to people, finding out why it's a problem for them, and listening from a position of empathy, trying to understand people. Like, what is their problem? More than listening, I think observing, empathizing is really seeing people do things in practice. Like giving, very basic things. Like when I do podcast guesting, when I work with clients in helping them build their profile, one of the first things I do is help them identify their ideal audience avatar. And I found, for example, that if you name the person, then the person that you're trying to speak to. So let's say my ideal audience avatar is Thomas, right? Then when I think about talking to Thomas, it changes how I communicate here, right? I'm speaking to Thomas. I'm speaking to you now. I'm not speaking to you guys, right? Like on YouTube. I'm speaking to one person. It may be Thomas, right? I've got that person in my head. That's a great way to understand people, is to name them. We've seen this, like that empathy or compassion fade, as they call it in psychology. We have a compassion fade in business when we see people as users or customers. We just see them as numbers, that they become a statistic. And therefore, we don't empathize with them. We don't ascribe any kind of emotions or frustrations to them, right? So that one of the starting points here in any kind of storytelling is to name the person you're speaking to. I knew a DJ in radio who said that what he did was he cut out a photo of one of his listeners and he stuck it on the microphone, like here, right in front of him. And every time that he went live and he spoke to the audience, he spoke to her. He was like, hey, like that person was there right in front of him, right? So he had that person in mind. And you think that, well, he's still doing the same thing, but the delivery is completely different, isn't it? That position of empathy changes because they're not a statistic anymore. It's like Joseph Stalin. I know, we're talking about empathy. It seems a bit out of place. But Joseph Stalin said that, one person dying is a tragedy, but 1 million people dying is a statistic, right? And it's the same with like how we communicate with people. It's like when it's one-to-one, when I'm talking to you, Thomas, I'm hearing your thoughts. I'm thinking of you, right? Don't get creeped out. But it just helps me communicate the point, right? That's what it's about. And I think we can all do that when we do these presentations, is who am I actually talking to? If I'm on a podcast, Who am I talking to? Who's that other person? What's their pain point? What's their frustrations? What else do we have comments-wise? Let's get those comments coming up now. I love choose your own map and own it. Yeah, make your map. Totally. I think, hey, we can all make our own maps. And, I love the work that you do, Gina. I think you've got the opportunity to really define that category as well. There's a lot of people in a lot of spaces these days, and it's very competitive because we all have a platform, right? But, constantly practicing your narrative and refining your architecture around the story is really important, because that helps you create that story that people will resonate with and be attracted to, that map that they need. Because there are naturally, in any space, there are leaders and there are followers. Like, followers need leaders and leaders need followers. It's 10%, 90%. The followers want somebody with a map, and the leaders want people who can implement that in the world, right? In the wider workplace. So we need each other. And you have to realize, what is my role here? Am I a follower who is looking for this, or am I a leader who is going to write a map? And we all have a role to play in that. If you don't have a map, then how can you lead these people? It's just part of the journey, I think, which is important. The whole storytelling journey is that nobody starts, with the map in hand. It's work in progress, right? What else do we have? Some more comments. Let's bring those up here. Everything we want to do lives on the other side of fear. Absolutely. Yeah, I think about that. I think about my own life, Mitch, that there's so many things that I've kind of been stuck with in my life that I've kind of hit a plateau, or I'd say more than a plateau, a ceiling, and I'm trying to get through. And I could spend, it's not just kind of time that's going to get you through, because, like the walking muscle in your leg analogy, you could never get through that. And there are things that I've wanted to learn, wanted to pick up as skills, which, for example, like asking. I was never good at asking, right? I was never good at sales. And I always thought that was a really important skill to have in business, especially if I was starting my own business. And so the only way that I could deal with that is find a way for me to sell in my terms, right? And this for me is it, getting on the microphone and talking to people. And so I could address that fear, I could get through it, but, not by doing it the traditional way, which is, getting on the phone, make 120 calls a day. I've done that, by the way, and it didn't work for me. But I found my own way of doing it, like telling stories, for example. So let's talk about how you can do that. Let's talk about how you can break through the fear barrier. I think of storytelling, especially, I think of storytelling it's a journey. And the way you get really good at this is find your stage. And, the word stage itself, think about that word stage in Latin. Stage, literally, whatever the Latin word for that, but the etymological root of stage is to stand, right? To stand up. And that means to stand up, not just stand up vulnerable in front of people, but to stand for something, right? And so that means a stage really is a place for you to stand up, face the moment of truth and be vulnerable and stand for something, have an opinion, have a voice, and be shot down in flames for it. But that's the only time that you're going to get better. One of the things people ask me about is getting nervous when I do podcasts. I've done, 2,000 podcasts. I've lost count. Well, maybe I've done 1,200 myself, and then with the business, 2,000. And yeah, I do. I did a podcast today, and I feel a little bit nervous before I go on. But what I think is that if I'm feeling nervous, it's the right thing to do. It's my body telling me, my autonomous nervous system telling me it's the right thing to do. If you don't get nervous doing something, if you're publishing something, if you're pushing something out, if you're writing something and you don't feel nervous about it, publishing it, then I don't think you've given enough of yourself to it. Like if you are going to press that button, that publish button, you think, oh, I'm not sure if I can do this. It's a little bit, I'm a bit worried. That's a sign that's a good thing to do, because you're making yourself vulnerable. You're opening yourself up to criticism. What we do, because we get nervous and scared, we edit ourselves down. We moderate ourselves, and then we just become, mainstream, and we just become liked, forgettable, completely forgettable. We just kind of every single business presentation you've ever sat through in a conference, which is just bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. How boring that is. But you all remember that guy who stood up and told stories and gave you a bit of himself or herself on stage, right? That's the one that you remember, like that teacher back in the day, right? Those are the ones that you take away memories from. Agile storytelling really means mastering the craft, getting on stage and doing it in an agile way, because you do not need a finished book to have a story worth telling. And if you've written a book like some of you I know have, that's the beginning, guys. That's not the end of the story. That's chapter 1 in your story. You've got to get out there. You've got to get on stage, practice. It's like stand-up comedy, right? I'm not talking about like Chris Rock and Will Smith incidents. Let's put that aside, folks. I'm talking about stand-up, like that craft of getting on stage and facing rejection. And that's the only way that you're going to get better and better and better at this craft. Face rejection. It's scary, guys, but that's where you can get feedback. You can learn. Maybe I said something today that didn't work. Maybe I tried out a little bit of new material. Maybe I got a laugh. Maybe I got a good response. I can see from your comments like what works and what doesn't work, right? I can see what resonates and what doesn't resonate. I've tried new things tonight and some of them bombed. Let's face it. It's like a joke you tell and you just get the crickets and the tumbleweed. But some of them worked, and that's the point. I get that feedback, and then I take that away, that data, and I roll that up into my set, my stand-up set, if you like. And then that becomes something more robust. I know, okay, maybe next time, based on the feedback from Gina and Thomas and Mitch and LinkedIn user, whoever you are, anonymous, I get that feedback and I can make my story more robust and better. I can practice that on a bigger stage. That's agile. And it's the practice of getting on stage and constantly putting yourself out there that is so important. Why this is so important and why podcasts are a great way to do it is because it's an agile way of doing it. You can do podcasts across time zones. You don't have to travel. You don't have to spend a day out of the office at a conference. I spoke at a conference last week and it's days. You have to go for the mic test and the run through and you have to do all that nonsense beforehand. It's a lot of work that goes into this stuff, right? It tires you out. You come back from a conference and you're like, oh, it takes you if you're old like me, it takes you like 2 or 3 days to recover from these things, right? But here I am, like evening in my home studio, speaking to you across time zones, people in different parts of the world. That's the beauty of podcasts as a stage, a digital stage where you can put yourself out there. And one of the reasons I think you should do it is for your own story as well. This is how I try to visualize this. Forgive me, this is my drawing. I try to visualize my story as a graph, right? And this is it in 3 chapters, like Shakespearean 3 acts, if you like. And, like most of us, we had this education thing that we were forced into. And like, you can see mine was just a complete mess. Here was a guy that liked psychology and, liked AI, took a degree course in AI, cognitive sciences in the 90s, just all over the place. Then I had this career thing, which was, when I teach English in Japan, I came back from Japan, started, in sales and communications industry, then started a communications research in business, then started selling to communications companies, then started advising communications companies, I'm talking telcos in the early 2000s, mobile companies, how to communicate with customers, which was like, in those days, that was like new. We have to speak to customers. What is this new thing that you're talking about? But that's what I was doing in the 2000s, when it just seems crazy now that you could build $1 billion, $1 trillion industry on that. But that's what happened. So if you look at my messy line, going back there, that was my career part. It's just a mess. And you know what happens? I exited the business in 2012, sold half my business to my business partner, went and traveled the world for 4 years initially with the family, and out of 3 suitcases, lived on tropical islands, lived on the Canary Islands, lived in the Mediterranean, lived on Okinawa, did it all, like Instagram sunsets, did all that, 4 years. And then I ended up in Japan, started a podcast, ended up starting a podcast agency, moved to Singapore. You know, what's kind of happening here is I feel I'm telling a story that probably a lot of people have lived in certain elements, which is that, you know, they didn't graduate with their why. They didn't, Simon Sinek style, find their why day one. You know, at college, I remember a guy at college I knew who, I went to school with him as well, actually. I remember now. In school, he loved drawing planes. And in class, you look at his notebooks, they were just full of planes. That's what he loved to do. You know, he wouldn't listen to anything the teacher said. He would just draw these sketches of planes. And everybody thought he was crazy. And then at college, he studied physics and engineering, I think. And then he went on to university and studied aerospace engineering, if such a thing, something like that. And then after university, he joined a aeronautical design company that designed planes. And then he was there. I mean, I saw on his LinkedIn profile, he was there for a number of years. And after he left that company, he started his own company designing and flying planes. And I think, oh my God, it's like this guy, he was born with his stars aligned day one. You know, from the moment he came out of the womb, he was probably dreaming of flying. And yet here he was making money and doing the dream job. And I look at that, and I think a lot of us look at those kind of stories, and we listen to people like Simon Sinek, and we sort of look at our Instagram, LinkedIn feeds, and we see all these people who've kind of got it worked out. And we think, what about me? Mine's a mess. Look at my story. Like, I didn't have that kind of why worked out. And then, you know, the self-doubt kicks in, which is like, hang on a second. Have I just wasted the last 20 years of my life? You know, what did I do wrong here? And you're smart, you're intelligent, right? But the problem is that you are probably curious. So you like to kind of explore these pivots in your life, and you like to try things and challenge things. And right, it takes you down these avenues, these adventures, and you're living this thing, and you're trying to work out what the hell it's all about. And then you see James from the school, and you think, what? Hang on a second. Did I not get the manual, the memo, how to do my career properly? Because it seems like I'm doing something wrong here, guys. And I feel we're all kind of living that in a little way. That's imposter syndrome, that maybe that self-doubt, because media portrays these imageries and these narratives in very perfectly curated ways. And what I put it to you this way is that, you know, really only myself, through getting on stage and telling those stories, have I really learned to make sense of it. You know, if you look back at that curve, that I can't even call it a curve, that ball of string that I made as my sort of joining the dots analogy, is if you have a look at it here, is that, you know, basically through storytelling, I made sense. You know, through storytelling, by getting on stage, through committing my scenes in my life, you know, I graduated with an AI degree in 1995, et cetera, putting those scenes out into the universe and seeing what the universe thinks of them and getting feedback on it. What you're doing is you're creating these neural connections inside your head that is making sense of your story slowly. And it's just like the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said that, you know, we live life forwards, but we have to understand it backwards. And what storytelling helps us do is create context out of lots of random events, which is really all it is. And it's a great way for you to make context out of lots of random events that happened in your life, right? A through story. And if you look at, you know, great Hollywood movies, you know, classical books, blockbuster stories, they all have what is called a through story. You know, I think about, for example, like The Godfather, you know, Michael Corleone, Al Pacino. You know, this guy's a murderer. He's a gangster. He's a criminal. He's a thug. We should, by rights, hate him. But you know what the director, Francis Ford Coppola, did very skillfully in that movie, and you can see this again, like more recently with the Joker, for example, that he made us empathize with the actor, because in The Godfather, the through story, the arrow of the narrative, if you like, that sort of compelling force that keeps moving us forward, isn't Al Pacino's desire to hurt and maim and kill people. It's not that. It's his desire to impress his father. That's it. Something we can all relate to, some of us, right? And because he wants to impress his father so much, he commits some heinous acts, right? And you look at that, for example, with the Joker, it's the same. Here is a socially dysfunctional loner, right, who is also a murderer. Why do we empathize with him? Because the director makes us empathize with that person. We understand that he is an actor in this bigger narrative, this through story, that this energy that's pushing him forward. And all he can do is really decide between turning left and right, not going backwards and forwards. He can only navigate the stream going down into the sea, not go back upstream, right? And that's the power of what a director can do with the story, create that through story. And so I put it to you as well, is that, you know, a great benefit of telling your story and practicing it is discovering what that through story is, because that is what people will empathize with. You know, I don't empathize with the fact that you're this job or you're from that company, you've done this. I empathize with that through story that's carrying you through these events. That's what I get. And that's why it takes a lot of practice. And the good thing is there, you know, there are techniques and there are structures. Yeah. There are structures that allow you to do this, right? One of the structures that I use, which is kind of a derivative of the hero's journey. Again, like check it out on my guide on Podcast Guesting Pro. It's explained. There's a video here, 3-box technique. We can just get this up on the screen in front of us. Yeah, so this is something that you can use. Like, you know, you go on a podcast or you do a presentation and people say, hey, so introduce yourself. I don't like that question, by the way. But you get this question asked a lot of time. You get it in business as well. And you may be, for example, trying to create change in your organization. You may be involved in transformation. You may be trying to influence people. And you can use a structure to do this. And I call it the 3-box technique, which is really, this is not rocket science, guys. You can see by how simple I've done this. It's past, present, future. Divide your story into 3 scenes. Past, present, future. Now think about this, right? That's life. That's how our story manifests. But, you know, the way that we tell our stories is often the wrong way. We often start in the past and then do present, then do future. Or we start in the future. If somebody tells me, you know, what they're building, I don't care. If you're building an app, so what? Like, I want to know how we got here. So imagine, for example, that you are directing a movie, and the opening scene of the movie, you imagine there's a dead body on the floor, smoke rising, somebody has been shot, a man lying on the floor, somebody drops a gun, and a woman running away into the distance. I know, I'm not going to win any awards for my direction, right? But you get the idea. That's a typical opening scene in a movie. And the reason why a scene starts in the present as opposed to in the past where it began is because it creates the dynamic tension in your story. When I see that, it's like, this is interesting. Why did she shoot him? I want to know the answer. And that then hooks us in. That gets us our attention. So the director's next step is to say, okay, right, let's go back. So these two, he and she, met at university many years ago, and it was a very happy existence. And then, you know, you go back to that scene and then it plays out, and then the whole thing sort of winds forward back to the present again. So that's a storytelling technique which is used in movies, it's used in books. It's that don't start at the beginning. start in the middle of the story and then take people backwards. Why did we get here? What went wrong? Now, you can tell that about your story. So when I tell my story, one of the the departures, if you like, is, I graduated with an AI degree, or, you can use whatever you want here. You can start and then take people back. How do we get here, right? You can use this in digital transformation. You could use this if you're creating change inside the organization. Rather than saying that, okay, this is what we need to do. We need to improve diversity in the company, or we need to improve sustainability. We need to do this in the company. What you're doing is you're pitching the future to them, but they don't know why they need the future before they even get there. You've got to show them what's broken first, and then show them what is the mindset that got us here. How did we get to this point? What's holding us back? And then pitch the promised land. What is the shape of the business that we need to become? So that's a technique. It takes practice, but podcasting is practice. You can do this at a comedy club every night for the next 52 weeks, and you'll get very good at it. Or you can book yourself into conferences and speak at every single conference, spend a whole lifetime traveling around the world speaking. You could take 10 years to do this, or you can do it on a podcast from the comfort of your own home. This is the third time I've been on air today, and I still haven't yet changed out of my shorts, right? And I haven't worn a tie. So think about that. That's very agile in that sense. But I think that's the whole point, is that you keep doing this. Like I mentioned Jerry Seinfeld earlier on. And, one thing that I admire about anybody who's really good at their craft is they never stop doing it. That the goal isn't to do this to get some kind of outcome. This is the goal. If you think about it, like the reward for being an entrepreneur isn't making a lot of money and exiting a business. The reward for being a thought leader isn't, for example, getting paid well to speak at conferences and so on. The reward is you keep getting to play the game, right? That's the reward. If you enjoy doing this, then the reward should be keep doing it, not that outcome that could be tangible in the sense of, I'm going to get a lot of leads out of this, right? And so I think, one thing that we can get out of storytelling generally is the journey, and committing to that and finding stages that you can get on and practice this craft. It's like learning. Learning never stops. You don't learn and then, at age 21, after you graduated, or like me, maybe a few years later, because I was not particularly clever, that after you graduate, you don't say, that's it. I've done my learning now. Now I'm going to go out and do. No, it's almost the other way around. It's like the learning starts when you graduate, right? And the day you stop learning is the day that you're in the box in the ground, right? And it's the same with storytelling. It's not something that you do, you take a course in to get good at, and then, okay, I'm done. I'm a storyteller now. I've now got to the level I need to get to and no more. It's like learning. It's like learning to tell and communicate and to influence and to engage people in meaningful, authentic and human ways. That's a skill that's worth committing a lifetime to. And that's what makes it really enjoyable, because the more you do it, not only do you connect with some amazing people around you, but you also make a lot of sense out of your own story, which is probably in itself the most valuable aspect of podcasting. Joining the dots, as Steve Jobs once said. So thank you so much for joining me today on this journey. It's been quite a while. We've done an hour together. I really appreciate your input. It's great to see some of the comments and some familiar faces, names, joining on the LinkedIn feed today. Thank you so much for being part of this LinkedIn Live. What's going to happen is I'm going to be doing this regularly. I'm going to be bringing people on the live show to talk about their storytelling journey, to talk about podcasting, what they've been doing, podcast guesting. We're going to do a special session podcast guesting for authors. I'm going to bring on some authors, podcast guesting for public speakers. I'm going to bring on people who've all got interesting stories to tell and how they've used podcasting to tell those stories. And each one is going to be different. And hopefully each one is going to give you a different idea about how you can use these amazing digital stages to reach new audiences. Thank you so much for joining. If you enjoyed this content, go and check out the Podcast Guesting Pro guide. There you go. That's it. It's all free. Just go to Podcast Guesting Pro/guide and you can get all this stuff free. There's like, I don't know, 40 articles there, 30 articles with tips, not just about podcast guesting, but about storytelling as well. So go and check that out. And if you have any questions, you know where I am on LinkedIn. I'm happy to chat with you. Happy to talk anything from podcasting to storytelling to thought leadership. Have yourself a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me today. I really appreciated that. And I'll see you on the next live show.